I open this academic ceremony in which Mr. Kourkopoulos is going to defend his thesis, Detection of Hazardous Substances in Food Contact Materials, Development and Evaluation of an Effect-Directed Screening Framework for Hazard Identification and Suspect Prioritization. Beautiful title. Welcome and lots of success together with your paronyms. And I welcome also your supervisors, Dr. Seim, Professor Seim and Dr. Vrolijk, the members of the opposition, of course, and the audience here present and online. But before we start the opposition, I give you the floor to present to your family and friends what you have described in your thesis.
Dear Rector, dear audience, thank you very much for being here. I will start by presenting part of my work that I did in the past 4 years at Maastricht University. I would like to start off with a small introduction regarding the topic. So I worked on food contact materials which are used for packaging, especially recycled paper ones. And as we know, those materials contain chemicals, and those chemicals can be distributed to two different categories. One category is called intentionally added substances, which are added there to add a property to the material, like making it leak-proof, oil-resistant, and so forth. And the other category is called non-intentionally added substances, which are added there without any intention, and they are usually coming from the recycling process by mixing with non-food-graded papers or as part of the production. It is estimated that around 11,000 food intentionally added substances are being present, and from 40 to 100,000. And as we know, recycling increases the level of contaminants. So contaminants which can be present, so substances that can be added without any intention, are maybe phthalates, which are plasticizers, but also PFAS and other contaminants. Furthermore, the vast majority of these substances has not been yet toxicologically assessed, and with regards to non-intentionally added substances, they have not even been identified yet, so we are not sure that they are present. Is it a danger, finally? Are those materials a danger to the consumers? That's something that we try to investigate, but currently in the EU, there are major challenges in assessing those materials. First of all, there is no specific framework which guides on the testing of those materials and also which substances can be present or not. There is a huge number of unassessed chemicals, and there are significant concerns regarding the safety accepted by the forums. And also there is a wide variability of protocols in literature that produces different results. Therefore, a standardized testing method which would consistently give a specific set of conclusions is not currently present. So the aim of the thesis was to create and evaluate a safety testing framework which for recycled paper that does not incorporate animal testing studies. Secondly, we tried to evaluate how sample preparation and analytical tests chosen affect the results and how we can fit those into our analytical routines. Finally, we tried to identify lists and compile lists of known substances and potentially dangerous substances by using lab cell-based tests, advanced chemical analysis, and also computational methods for predicting toxicity. Let's start off with the presentation, with our first part of developing this method. And what we came up with was an effect-directed analysis. So this compiles of 3 tiers. On the first tier, we are preparing the sample and then we are assessing it as a whole, the mixture of chemicals that comes directly from the food contact materials. Then the ones that show results on or positive activity in the lab-based tests, they proceed further because we consider them toxic or substance of interest, actually, samples of interest. And then we do advanced chemical analysis of those, where we are trying to identify which chemicals produce this activity. And first, we are running database research for established hazards, and we compile a list with substances that we know that they are toxic. And then we are using also in silico predictive methods to compile a list of substances that could potentially produce toxic results. This method provides a picture of the total toxicity of the materials, including the non-intentionally added ones, but also the effect of mixtures, which can alternate from the ones that individual chemicals produce. It's high throughput and cost-effective, and assess many toxicological endpoints at once via a battery of bioassays. So let's start off. As a first step, we do a sample preparation. Secondly, we conduct the lab-based tests. The samples that show activity in lab-based tests, they are proceeding further in order to identify the chemicals being present. And finally, we derive two lists, one with established hazards and one with potential hazards. So chemicals that can produce a toxic activity. The sample preparation, we did it according to the regulation 10/2011 for plastics. There is currently no regulation for recycled paper and cardboard. And we have used three different materials. One was coated paper, which is commonly used for liquids, which is covered with, so it's paper with a layer of plastic. Secondly, we had waxed paper, which is basically paper with a layer of wax, and it's used for oil resistance. And finally, we have plain paper, which is used for dry food materials like for dry foods, which can be bread or something like that. And we have used four different food simulants. So those are solutions that aim to simulate the contact of foods with certain food categories. So aqueous foods, 10% ethanol is used, and with aqueous foods, we can imagine something like water with neutral pH. With food simulant B or acidic foods, so 3% acetic acid, we can imagine something like tomato paste or orange juice. Fatty foods can be a pizza, and which 50% volume per volume ethanol is used. And finally, for dry foods, we can imagine something like a bread, where we use Tenax, a powderous material. And those are all provided under Regulation 10/2011 for plastic food contact materials. But if we use those as such, in 100% concentration, we see toxicity already in our lab-based tests. And this is because these food simulants are already toxic to cells. So we don't really see anything which derives from the chemicals being present. Therefore, as a first step, we tune the concentrations of those. And if we use lower concentrations, we see that there is no background toxicity due to the food simulants, but the toxicity which we identify is possibly coming from individual or the mixture of these chemicals. Then we have tried to establish a method in order to analyze these, because actually the different solvent conditions create also disruptions with our analytical methods. And as a first step, we have spiked paper samples. So basically, we got a brush, and we have brushed a solution on top of our food contact materials, which consisted of phthalates, bisphenols, and PFAS. And those are common substances that can be present in these materials as a result of contamination. Then we have used two different sample preparation methods. One is called migration, and this contains the food simulants as we discussed under the Regulation 10/2011. And the second one aimed in recovering as much as possible of the substances being present in these materials, and this is called exhaustive extraction. The first one migration aimed to simulate real food contact conditions. What will happen if we place this material in contact with orange juice, for example, for 1 year on the shelf, while the second one aimed to recover holistically all the substances, chemicals being present in these materials. And then we derived the sample, which was a solution. And we have used two methods in order to analyze these contaminants. The first one consisted of a direct injection of this solution to the device. And this was for molecular contaminants. The second one was trying to dry it, evaporate all the solvent being present, and reconstitute it in a medium which is more suitable for our analysis. Method A, directly injecting, led to the minimal loss of substances, while the second method led to loss possibly due to evaporation or loss of solubility in the second medium coming in. Additionally, we did elemental analysis for chemicals such as lead, cadmium, and so forth. And we have also tried to tune the methods. First, we have tried to dilute it, because acidic conditions, for example, in food simulant B, create an disruption with ICP-MS. And secondly, we have tried again to dry and reconstitute the sample. In this case, actually, the second method led to better results, because elemental contaminants, they are not prone to evaporating. But also, the food simulant A, which was acidic conditions, led to better extraction of the substances. Lastly, we have done in vitro tests. And those in vitro tests covered 5 different endpoints. One was liver toxicity. The second one was intestinal toxicity. Then we have assessed genotoxicity and mutagenicity as EFSA dictates for all food contact substances. And then we have assessed dioxin activity, a common contaminant which can be found in these materials. And we have also tested for endocrine toxicity. So for 2 different types, androgens and estrogens. We have also used, except for the lab-based tests, computational toxicology, where we analyze the structure and we have tried to predict the toxicity of the substances by looking at their chemical components and tuning. And we have found that basically 8% of the substances, so a small number of substances was identified only by using lab tests and subsequently searching in databases, and the higher number was able to be potentially classified as hazardous via the in silico methods. And as you can see, the numbers on the established hazards are low, while the potentially hazardous substances are much more, possibly, but they need still refinement. Liver toxicity in vitro, in most samples, could not be linked to substances. And that's a problem because we couldn't find neither established hazards in the database that we used or in silico models that can also simulate and predict this kind of activity. With regards to intestinal toxicity, there was no information available in neither databases or predictive models. With regards to the genotoxicity, we didn't detect in vitro genotoxicity, but substances were detected being present via the chemical analysis in all the samples. Endocrine activity, we have identified estrogenic activity, which is connected to estrogens, and androgenic activity, which is connected to androgens in many samples, but they did not correlate in all of the cases with the chemicals that we found. And finally, with regards to dioxin activity, we were able to identify dioxin activity in vitro, but some samples didn't show results in our lab-based tests, but chemicals were being present that can produce this kind of activity. And finally, for elemental contaminants, we have found high levels of elemental contaminants in red in the majority of the samples, much higher than the specific limits set by the regulation. And in some cases, there were no limits for certain contaminants, such as cobalt, nickel, or uranium. But those were present. So we think that basically we should also try to arrange this exposure for the consumers. Arriving at the conclusions, the hazards identified in recycled packaging depend a lot on how we prepare the samples. So if we use food simulants, we have a different kind of result because of the selective recovery of certain chemicals. Whereas if we use exhaustive extraction methods, we recover different substances, but how well they mimic real conditions, that's the big question there. Tests that mimic real food contact show everyday risks that's more suited to the application that those materials are used for. But stronger extraction tests uncover hidden chemicals that can be present, and they migrate under the conditions that are not foreseen under these food migration testing. Many different molecular contaminants and toxic elements were present and were found in our analytical tests. The question is if they are risky, if they pose a risk for consumers or not. And finally, the lab tests and the computational tools that we used helped reveal hazards, but still struggle in consistent data and linking of effects with our results from the lab tests. With this one, I would like to thank you for your time and
Give the word back to the pro-rector.
exactly.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, dear candidate. Now we can start the opposition. The first opponent is also the chair of the assessment committee, that's Professor Opperhuizen. His chair is risk assessment and risk communication in toxicology in the Faculty of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences in the University of Maastricht. Professor Opperhuizen.
Dear Mr. Candidate, thank you for your presentation, also for the impressive thesis. I want to congratulate with that, and also the promotion team, very well done. A lot of work done, and a very important item, very undiscovered area of food package materials, a growing area, and a lot of chemicals, so quite turbulent issue. My first question is about, for your thesis, is about chapter 2. A very simple question. Why did you write it?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and for the question. At the point when I started my PhD thesis, actually, there was no comprehensive review of the methods being in literature. And as we discussed, there is a wide variability of protocols. So we had to systematically assess what's being present, identify the gaps, and then start building our method from that.
Yeah, that's also the normal way of doing. But I was a little bit surprised by your thesis, your proposition number 12. One of your assistants can read it out, hopefully. And hopefully you can a little bit press the second part of the sentence. Can you read it?
Position number 12.
Yeah.
The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic.
Yeah, so learning from yesterday is very helpful. And that's basically also science. So learning from yesterday's logic is guiding you to the future. So why did you put this proposition in this thesis? What is the logic of that one?
Well, at that point, I thought that we should start anew. Of course, we have to know what's being present and what's being built, but in this case...
Now, for the chapter number 2, I understand that completely. Yeah. That's the normal way to do. But you seem to discuss that in proposition 12, that you agree with Peter Drucker. I like the work of Drucker, but he said, well, it's not a good thing to use yesterday's logic. Mm-hmm. So why did you use this proposition?
We have tried to see what was happening yesterday with new eyes, actually, and not the logic of yesterday. And that's what we did, because previously the standard was assessing exhaustively the materials. We have tried to incorporate migration methods, which are not being present at the moment, and that's something that we considered it's useful in that shape, but also criticizing the food simulants themselves, because that was also the base for plastics. And so it's basically, yeah.
But now we have a new logic. You made this thesis, you published it, some papers are cited already. I'd like to go to the very end of your thesis, page 267. So it's the end of the general discussion, the 267. You have future perspectives. Maybe you can have a look also at that. But anyway, there are at least 4, but maybe 6 future perspectives. So you need new databases, predictive toxicology, methodological innovations, paradigm shift. What is the most important way forward?
Paradigm shift is the base of the strategy, and we always have to start with a strategy. And then the evolution of the methods that can be used.
In this field, the evolution of the methods, for instance, predictive toxicology or the databases, that's work carried out already 40 years. So what is the the horizon for these 4, maybe 6 developments you see as future perspectives? When can we use this kind of methods?
Yes, I see that we will have to turn at some point from individual assessed chemicals to assessing mixtures, and at the moment we cannot do that, but that's what the consumer is exposed to.
Yeah.
And that's the paradigm shift that I'm talking about. Also, a second paradigm shift is basically which of course we are doing it already in a certain sense, moving from animal testing methods to non-animal testing methods. And incorporation of NAMs in our routines. There are some paradigms for that, for example, for genotoxicity by EFSA, where you use a battery of bioassays first, and then if those are negative, then you can skip this material, but also if they're positive, you have to confirm it with animal studies. So actually I say animal studies as confirmation. So that I see 2 things that basically are the essence of this paradigm shift and how we assess. First is assessing mixtures, and secondly, of course, incorporating the non-animal methodologies.
But in your introduction on the slide number 3 or 4, you said, well, there is no framework in the European Union.
Yes.
And that's also due to a lack of methodologies. So if we want to have a new framework established and endorsed in the European Union, we need something. When can we do something? Is it 5 years from now, 1 year from now, 20 years from now, 5 decades?
Well, that's because now we move in many fronts, and this methodology incorporates different aspects. So one, we have the lab-based tests, so the in vitro tests. Secondly, we have predictive toxicology. And then we have now the high-resolution mass spectrometry, which gives us also opportunities to identify substances with higher confidence.
But it's still in the methodology.
Exactly. So this method, at the moment, if not, we cannot address these limitations. It's useful as a proof of concept itself, but it's not ready for use, actually. And when I see it, because there are many fronts, if we had only one front, I could confidently say that we can, in 5 years, better that and give that focus there, and then we can use it confidently. In this case, it moves with the whole science of toxicology, because also that's the direction. Are we moving in general from individual substances to mixtures?
Yeah.
How much do we invest there? How we build our in silico models in order to represent this kind of
but what if we have, let's say, 1 million now, where should we invest it?
Spread it in a way, but I think assessing mixtures, that's the first point, and identifying hazards confidently within mixtures.
And in the future perspective, you say also one important issue about collaboration. You said it in several places.
Yes.
Also collaboration between regulatory authorities and industry stakeholders. Do you see that happen?
Well, the industry usually goes for advocacy, and of course they have to safeguard, based on law, the safety of foods that they market, but that's still in question if that happens confidently or not, or if, because I have been also in forums, for example, the food packaging forum, where there were several companies that already published one specific kind of guidance, and they were happy with what was what was going now. So, on the other hand, we can say that we need to better specific things. That's also what we derive from this method, and I'm not sure if everybody, it's in their own benefit to take it so much further and invest so much.
Well, at least it is a good ambition. I think that
Exactly.
still a governmental role to play.
Yeah.
And I thank you for your answers, and I will give back the floor to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Opperhuizen, for your opposition. Then we come to the following opponent, who's also a member of the assessment committee. That's Professor Bouwmeester. His chair is Advanced Cell Models in Toxicology, and that's in the Toxicology Institute in the Wageningen University and Research. And I would like to thank you very much for coming all the way from Wageningen. The University of Maastricht is always glad to have guests from outside.
And it's a pleasure to be here. Dear candidate, I compliment you, of course, firstly with the accomplishment of your thesis, and I include in my congratulations your supervisors. It's a nice piece of work, a detailed analysis of all different aspects, but always space to ask a few more detailed questions, perhaps. So I would like to start with work that you have in your end of your thesis, chapter 7, if I'm correct. And the materials you used, you nicely described them also in your presentation, might contain ink. And if I look at ink, I always think immediately of nanoparticles. And in this last chapter, you used ICP-MS, but could you think of an approach to also try to identify particles in your extracts or in your migration essay?
So, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for kind words and for the question. Particles are indeed a big topic, actually, and also for the different forms of metals that can be present. Because now we just did an elemental analysis, we identified if they're being present, but not the state that they're being present. Usually, particles, to the best of my knowledge, they are being assessed not with chemical methods, but there are physical methods, because actually particles create toxicity through physical mechanisms.
What kind of techniques? So have you heard about single particle ICP-MS?
No. Okay. We didn't really use it in that framework because also we didn't really focus on that one. But for example, in microplastics, in many cases we are using also microscopy in order to, and also size distribution in order to identify these kind of substances. So indeed, this proposition could also be incorporated, but taking a look more closely to the particles that are being present would also add different kind of methods in our framework. And indeed, that would be useful, but in this paradigm, we didn't really use it.
No, well, then you have to use the 1 million that you was offered, and then you could extend perhaps your analytical toolkit, which I would really urge you to do if you would continue to focus to, for instance, use a single particle ICP-MS and see which particles migrate. They might exert different kind of toxicity, of course. And then moving to chapter 6, so jumping from one to the other, there you combined different search strategies to try to identify the hazards associated with the not with the particles, but with the chemicals that you observed. And to my knowledge, also the OECD QSAR tool uses quite some databases to link structures to their activity. So why did you do both approaches, a database search yourself, and what is then the added value of using the QSAR tool?
So via the database research, we're searching for established hazards, so not a prediction via their chemical structure, but the ones which have been already established by EFSA or by ECA or by the EPA in the US, EPA. Indeed, first we have tried to compile a list of substances that are already classified by the official institutions as such, as hazardous.
But I think you also refer that you use databases like ToxCast and
that was on the second part, on the in silico part.
Yes, so that's what I mean.
Exactly.
So the in silico, so the database search and the QSAR, which is also an in silico search.
Yeah. So the database search, it yielded low numbers of chemicals that can be classified as hazardous, and we still had activity which we couldn't explain. So on a second step, we have tried to use ToxCast and also other in silico methods to identify basically via the molecular structure potentially hazardous activity of these substances, properties. So that was the second step in trying to refine the list of the chemicals that we have derived and focus on specific chemicals that would be of interest. And that was the second filter that we applied.
Do I understand it correctly that you, for your database search, use the identified chemicals with some level of assurance, I guess? And for the QSAR tools, did you then enter there also features that were not identified or not present in the ToxCast list?
No. So we have only used confidentially identified chemicals also for the ToxCast, for example, or OECD QSAR.
If I then assume that in the OECD models, the same ToxCast databases were used, what's then the difference in these two types of analysis?
The one is based on predicted kind of toxicity, while the database research is on established toxicity. So basically it's validated that those chemicals produce toxicity.
Yeah.
So the second ones, the list which contains the potentially hazardous chemicals, needs to be still assessed in order to validate that basically those chemicals produce toxicity. And this is basically a list of prospect chemicals that can undergo the individual toxicological assessment that we do in order to validate if they are hazardous or not.
Okay. Yeah. And then you, in these database searches, you of course have to use individual chemicals and link that to observed or predicted effects. But you also state in your thesis, and you highlighted it in your presentation, that there's not always an overlap between the outcomes of the in vitro tests and the results from the analytical confirmation. Sometimes, so perhaps you found more effect in vitro than you could identify with the chemical features or chemical substances. What can be the underlying cause of this?
Well, first, it's a misalignment of how we approach the analysis. In vitro, we analyzed mixtures, so not individual substances, but also the interaction between those. While when we try to identify hazardous chemicals, we are assessing them individually. And we already know that effects such as potentiation can occur, for example, when two chemicals which are not inherently toxicants, when being present in the same environment, can produce toxicity, because one maybe activates a receptor or makes it more prone to the activity of the second one. Yep. And that's something that I was also previously discussing about the paradigm shift, because that's what we see when we test. We see the interaction of all of these chemicals being in one space and interacting with certain biological entities.
But would you then, so I agree with that, but thinking of a paradigm shift, would you then say for future analysis we do not anymore need analytical confirmation because we're only interested in the effects of either single substances or the mixtures? So we can completely leave the analytical side of the work and focus only on the in vitro assays?
Well, I wouldn't say, because the thing is that what combination can exist, for example, in a food of these different chemicals could be different from food to food. And now we regulate single substances. Of course, that can be an added value when we can assess also mixtures of those.
Or change the paradigm that we do not regulate single substances.
No, that's not what I think it's correct. But what I think is that this method can act as a complementary method to the toxicological assessment that we do so far. It doesn't aim to replace completely the traditional toxicological assessment that we do.
And in your title, and also throughout your thesis, I liked it a lot. You stick to the term hazards, because you analyze the hazards of chemicals. But consumers are interested in risks, I think. So how can what should be done in addition outside the work in your thesis to bridge the hazards that you identified to really advise on potential risks? How would you go about this? So if a consumer or if the Dutch Food Inspection would come to you, well, now I would love to know the risks upon using these recycled materials.
Of course, exposure is a big part. And now what we are doing only is hazard identification. We are not really dealing at all with the exposure of the consumer. So basically external dose and then the toxicokinetics which go on. So basically we don't have...
I think time is flying, but if I would challenge you, could you perform a risk assessment? Or would it...
No, I cannot with this kind of setting, but I can identify substances that can be potentially hazardous and they can further be assessed with regards to exposure. And in many cases, when we are talking about potentially hazardous substances, they can be assessed with regards to their validated activity when we validate that. Yes.
Thank you. I think I have to return the word back to the Prorector.
Thank you very much for your opposition, Professor Bouwmeester. We come now to the following opponent, who's also a member of the assessment committee. That's Professor van der Meer, and her chair is Sustainability of Chemicals and Materials in the Faculty of Science and Engineering in the University of Maastricht. And today she has also accepted the role of secretary of this committee, for which I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, first of all, I would also like to congratulate you with this work. I think the topic is very important, hazardous substances in food contact materials. And I also like the large number of results you have created. Myself, I come more from the sustainability background, where this also plays a role. So I've read it with much interest, but I would like to discuss a little bit more on this topic. And I would like to do that based on proposition 11. So I would like to ask one of the paranymph to read out this proposition.
Proposition 11. The circular economy in food packaging may only succeed if sustainability goals are aligned with robust consumer health protection.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, in principle, I agree with this. So you would say we don't have much of a discussion, but I would like to have a discussion with you on more detailed aspects. But first, I would like to start by asking you, what do you define as the circular economy within the context of your work, like food packaging?
So, with regards to the circular economy, this is part of the 3 R's, so recycling is one of those. So I think that's one of the methods that we employ in order to achieve our sustainability goals in Europe, at least, with the current developments. So that's basically the part that would cover.
Yeah, of course, it is part of the circular economy. I think it's much broader. We start with thinking, can we live without the material, so reduce, for instance. But yeah, I understand in these kind of applications you need a packaging material with certain functions. And then you write in your thesis that, well, one of the reasons for doing your work is that recycling adds chemical complexity to the materials. You state that on page 11 in chapter 1. Could you explain to me, what do you mean by chemical complexity?
So chemical complexity means that there is an extra interaction that can add chemicals or can complicate the specific makeup that the material had before recycling. And this is due to cross-contamination, for example. It can be also mixed with non-food grade paper, but also it can be that the extra production steps or manufacturing steps can add more chemicals via the processing aids that we use in order to add new properties to the material, or maybe due to the handling that it's later on being used. So the material that we have before recycling is not the material that we have after recycling. And that's the complexity which also creates possibly more risks or less risks for the consumer.
Yeah, I understand that point, but we want to move really towards a circular economy where we can keep recirculating these materials. And I think what you have analyzed is only what happens like after one cycle or maybe two. So how do you think our society would look like if we continue doing like this, like adding complexity and contaminations? And would that be a good future for all of us? Because at some point everything will be contaminated, or not?
Well, yes, that's why we have milestone checks after when the material enters the market, and that's where we don't have, but we should apply such. And of course, materials which are hazardous or considered hazardous under a specific framework, they should be phased out and not be reused. But also we should refine the ways that we are recycling. So avoid as much the contamination, the cross-contamination, but also the mixing of non-food-graded paper with food-graded paper, which can happen also in many cases. And that's why in many cases now we're using virgin paper for primary contact. So a material which comes directly in contact with food is virgin, so it wasn't recycled, but also the outer, so the secondary packaging can be recycled in most cases, because we have this kind of risks.
Yeah, I agree. We should improve our recycling, but maybe we could also not focus on these paper-based materials, because what I learned is that these mostly have plastic layers on it, and maybe there are other materials that can be better recycled without all these cross-contaminations, like maybe glass or aluminum, or I don't know. Have you considered this, or
well, indeed,
is it ongoing in your field also?
There are bio-based also materials which are biodegradable themselves, so they don't need to be recycled That's indeed one of the ways, and I'm not sure if it's the best one, but still it's one of these ones which are employed the current strategies. Glass, the thing is that with regards to glass, paper and plastic are quite formidable as materials. And that's why we use them a lot, because they can have different properties which fit different kinds of applications. For example, you have oil-resistant paper, which you can easily add a coating on. You have also paper which can be used in high temperature. If you have glass in high temperature, in many cases it will break. So it's quite, it has to do with how formidable this material is, and that we can also fit it into different kinds of applications. Glass is always a more inert way, but it cannot be used in all cases, and we have always to do a risk-benefit analysis. So what actually we gain by using these materials, and also with regards to logistics, to business, and so forth, and which applications it can have, compared to how much risk we are adding with recycled paper. And as a first point, first we have to have a method, which we don't have, then try to refine maybe the way that we process this material and see if we can achieve an adequate level of protection. And if not, then the last part would be to phase out. But erasing or phasing out what we already have, which we know that it can work in certain cases, might not be a direct choice, for example, at the moment.
Yeah, what I read a bit in your work is that you also assume that these paper-based packagings are quite good from an ecological perspective, because at some point in your impact section you also write down that, well, we should not only look at ecological gains, but also at safety for consumers. But I think from a materials perspective, you could also choose different materials and try to combine the two in a kind of approach where you optimize the two of them. I know that will make it more complex, but is that something you think would be valuable and could be done with the methods you have developed during your thesis?
Well, my methods are directed to recycled paper, which is already in the market. But of course, for example, for glass, there is a mixture of glass and plastic in many cases, which makes the material more durable. We can produce new materials and we can optimize materials. The question is how much we are sure basically these new materials are also suited for purpose when we are using it in the public, and how much exposure do we have for these materials to the consumer. And that's something that I think we can better materials for different uses, and they can be tailored applications, but they should go hand in hand with the risk, and we should also assess the risk of those when we just introduce them to the market. So yes, I'm open to these new applications, but with a cautious step, for example.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers, and I want to give the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you, Professor van der Meer, for your opposition. Now we come to the following opponent, that's Dr. Bauma, and her expertise is risk assessment, product safety, at the Office for Risk Assessment and Research in the Netherlands Food and Consumer Product Safety Authority, and that is in Utrecht. And thank you for coming all the way from Utrecht.
Thank you. I would like to congratulate you on your thesis and the amount of work you did. You've been invited twice to present it at the EFSA Food Contact Network Group, and it was highly appreciated also there. So that means it's quite significant what you did. One of your conclusions was that sample preparation is very important, and I agree with you. I worked for 5 years at the Official Control Laboratory, and I was wondering about P1. I was wondering what kind of material it was, but I know now because you showed it. And you did the migration test by submersion, and thereby you also test the contact site that is not intended to come into contact with food. So how do you relate the results that you gained from the migration test to food safety?
Mm-hmm. So, dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and the question. At the moment, we just tried a very simple system in order to assess paper. And for example, in plastic-coated paper, this can be done. You can make a mold, which you will place your material, and then you will have contact only from one side and see the deterioration also of the material over the time. so how it reaches further layers except for plastics over at the testing period. But for plain paper, we cannot do that in certain cases. And also the same goes for waxed paper, which you use 50% ethanol. That's a problem in trying to assess real kind of migration, because these food contact materials actually are not representing maybe into the highest extent these food applications. And that can be, for example, when you have a pizza where you have a bit of oil, but the food simulant is completely aqueous. It's 50% ethanol. So indeed, that the system that we used is really simple, just to prove the concept, and that's how it is used in many applications in literature. But of course, an optimization of the systems should also be done in order to assess better, actually, this contact of food with the food contact material.
Yes, because I assume that P1 also has a functional barrier because it's used as a Tetra Pak. And I was wondering, because the industry complains a lot about the food simulants that are not that are used because they're intended for plastics, and now they're applied to paper and board. And if you see swelling or if it affects the material, you should not do a migration test, it says officially. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, these tests that you did, how is it representative for what would migrate into food?
The same question is with regards to the 10/2011 for plastics. How representative are they? That's the current basis that we have. And it needs optimization. There are some actions that are taking place now in Europe in order to develop better food simulants or more representative food simulants by using different types of even food, like polenta, for example. But we are not there. And how you start usually is by assessing what is already being there and see its flaws or maybe limitations, and try to find gaps in order to identify what you will do next and what you will optimize in a more targeted way. And that's what we did now. And all of these are also conclusions of our work that can be also propositions for further work and optimization of the food migration tests, actually.
So, but if you would apply this bioassays in official controls, would you suggest to have these food simulants, or would you have completely other food simulants? Because in the end, you want to, you do not want to have an exact hazard identification. You want to have control the risk for the consumer. Mm-hmm. So, what kind of food simulants would you like to see for food, especially for paper and paperboard?
Well, that has to be defined based on the maybe an approach could be that you will define the food that's coming more often with paper, and then you will focus on those ones to develop food simulants which are more targeted then. But of course, at the moment, I cannot really say which food simulants would be better, because those are the standard ones that we have, and there hasn't been much research into developing ones that, compared to those ones, are better. So still the question remains. It's a matter of open research. I already maybe expressed an approach of how I would just try to focus on specific kind of applications, and therefore you can try to build systems that can physicochemically represent better this kind of foods. But still, it's really an uncharted ground, and there is specific kind of developments, but those are really remote. So there is not a general kind of strategy that says we have to try to find food simulants based on this kind of applications, and we will focus on that and try to make it more physicochemically representative of the foods that would come into contact. For example, bread could be, or something like that.
I'm moving a little bit into the direction of Professor Opperhuizen. What do you think needs to be done in order to have these bioassays replacing the chemical testing for an official control laboratory?
Well, if you have a biosensor which can very specifically identify one chemical, like the dioxin, which is not also very specific because it can be also polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that can activate it. Then you can say, oh, we are there, we can replace completely a chemical analysis with biosensing. But at the moment, except for receptor-based tests, which might be quite representative of a category of chemicals, but not one chemical itself, you cannot really define which chemical can produce this activity with certainty, because there can be chemicals of different categories. The aim here is not to replace completely chemical analysis, is to do targeted chemical analysis, in the sense that if a sample produces an activity on one of the categories or one of the endpoints that we are interested in, which can be endocrine disruption, genotoxicity, and so forth, then basically we will move and assess further the sample and not spend time on samples that are not of interest because they don't contain such chemicals. Which chemical? It's still a matter of chemical analysis.
Well, in the Framework Directive, it states that migration of substances to food should not endanger human health. So I thought it would be very nice to have only bioassays instead of chemical testing, because that's very complex. So I was wondering if you see a future for that, to change the testing completely to only bioassays.
Well, I wouldn't say so. And basically, the added value of bioassays is assessing the hazard of chemicals in combination and see if there can be a potency of producing hazardous activity. But I don't think that this system can ever evolve into something that, in such complicated conditions and diverse conditions, which is the recycled paper, for example, or even food contact materials which can be virgin, can actually lead to the replacement of chemical analysis as we know it. Chemical analysis is a means of screening, of monitoring with confidence via standards and validating our assessments. This is more of an exploratory tool with its limitations, and it can be used in the framework of identifying substances which are of interest, because that's why we are trying to identify hazard or not. But it can never be our everyday kind of screening without chemical analysis.
Thank you very much. I will give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bouma, for your position. We come to the following opponent, that is Dr. Brandsma. He's Associate Professor of Analytical Chemistry in the Institute for Life and Environment, and it is in the Free University in Amsterdam. And thank you for coming all the way from Amsterdam.
Thank you, Rector. Dear candidate, first of all, I would like to congratulate you with your impressive work. I read it with great interest. And as you already heard, I'm an analytical chemist, so I would focus my questions a little bit more on chapter 5 and 6. And when reading these chapters 5 and 6, I just was a little bit triggered by the amount of features that you found, and I think also yourself. But when I looked at that, especially compare chapter 5 and 6 with each other, I saw that, maybe I'm mistaken, but I thought the similar samples were taken and the same high-res method was used. Also, again, an Orbitrap, C8 column, gradient, and ESI positive and negative was measured. However, when I then looked at the amount of features that you detected, I saw that in chapter 5 you detected up to 50,000 features. And then I went reading further in chapter 6, and in 6 you observed 28,000 features, so almost a half, and that was a combined GC with LC. And I was wondering, because I was reading, I was screening it, and probably you can tell it me better, why that differences? Why did you find so much differences in features?
Well, first of all, dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for the question. Chapter 5, which was the method development, focused only on LC amenable chemicals. And that's where we found the majority of the features, while on chapter 6 we also employed GC analysis, which also added in complexity. The samples were not exactly the same because they were derived from the same starting material, but on chapter 5, those were actually samples that were from a different, for example, sheet of paper, but also they were spiked. So they also came into one extra sample preparation step, which was actually using the brush and spreading basically this mixture of chemicals with the solvents that also were incorporated in this sample preparation. Well, the number of features in both cases is high, and the majority of those were identified in LC-amenable chemicals, as expected. But of course, this kind of different steps can also add some complexity or also differences between the two analyses that are presented in the different chapters. But the principle of the method remains the same, actually. So it's the same derivative material, which was handled from the same batch, but there was an extra step on the sample preparation process, for example, in these two cases.
Okay, so you mean that by introducing this extra step, you see way more features than actually. That's what you more or less observed.
Would be, yes, but I'm not sure where this derives. That's.
I also checked your minimum peak intensity that you use, and I do understand you always have to do a cutoff because you cannot include all the peaks that you see. Yeah. That has also something to do with the quality of the peaks. But I saw that in chapter 5 you use a minimum peak intensity of 10,000, but in chapter 6 you went to a peak intensity of 50,000. I was just wondering why you increased the limited peak intensity, because by increasing that you also miss more. What was the reason for that?
So basically, these two chapters were done in a different sequence. So first, we have produced chapter number 6, which has been done with the specific limitations, and then we have done the work for chapter 5, where we have tested actually, and then we optimized the methods that we employed. Because on the first test that we did in chapter 6, basically that was the holistic analysis of all the chemicals that are being present, and we didn't have any idea of what we could encounter. So a limit, which is more strict in this case, was making more sense. While on chapter 5, we were focusing only on more specific chemicals, and with a prior knowledge of what we were analyzing, and then we could open the spectrum. Of course, in both cases, there were limitations in identifying all of these features, because the database that we had available, in many cases, were not also suitable for food contact materials, and that's something that you can ask if they are present, for example, out there. There are some limited, for example, but we couldn't really find ones that could fit for purpose. That's why we left all of these kind of features which could not be identified. But in many cases, those could be chemicals which are meaningful, and we can see in vitro.
Okay.
But that was the difference, exactly.
Yeah. Now I do understand it. When I looked at your workflow, you did effect-directed screening. That was your workflow. And you found like many features. We all discussed it already, up to 50,000 features. And I was just wondering, like in your workflow, you did not include fractionation, for example. For example, in EDA, it's quite common to include fractionation because the samples can be so complex. Why did you choose not to include fractionation, for example, in your workflow?
Actually, we have tried to incorporate fractionation, but because it was a methodology, it was on the later steps of my PhD, so on the 4th year, we couldn't incorporate as such, and because first we had to test how these different food simulants would be incorporated, and then try to see how dilution, for example, adds complexity, and that's something that we started the project on that, and we stopped because we had the time limitation. But of course, EDA contains fractionation. And basically, after many fractionation steps, you are pointed down to the chemicals which specifically could pose this activity. And that is also a proposition for optimization in later research. We thought that in this point, it's better to make a skeleton and incorporate all the different steps, which actually are the in vitro testing, the chemical analysis, and the in silico methods and the database research in hazard identification, and try to prove on these basic steps what are the limitations, and then dive deeper, for example, into how to better chemical analysis via fractionation or different sample preparation steps. And that's one of the steps that can also be incorporated in later research as a future perspective.
Okay. maybe it's the last question, but I was just wondering, like I was reading that 0.4% of all the futures were identified. And I know you probably are maybe a little bit disappointed, and most people are disappointed if you come up with this number. I think it's impressive that at least 0.4% was identified. But how can we increase this number? Like waiting for better libraries, but how can we increase this percentage? Because in general, 0.4% of the total is not that high.
Well, indeed, out of this chemical space, and that also says about the chemical complexity that we were discussing previously of these samples, and how confidently we can identify hazards when, especially, we have even recycling, which adds complexity. At the moment, the initiatives within the EU are to try to build extra databases. And this is DDU, for example, in Denmark, which is also building databases. Well, we can maybe try to add something like we do for PFAS, where we have a fluorescent kind of method, which gives the total spectrum of the
You may finish your answer. You may also say enough is enough.
I can finish answering.
Okay.
So we might do something like a bulk analysis. For example, for PFAS, you can identify the fluoride features, and then you can just classify that basically there is a big part of the spectrum belongs to this category. Maybe you can do that for other categories based on their chemical properties. And that's a method of exclusion, for example. But this still needs to be investigated.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brandsma, for your opposition. Mr. Kourkopoulos, the time appointed for the defense of your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the way you defended it. And I ask you and your company, on site and online, to await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. With that, I suspend the meeting.
Thank you very much.
I reopen this academic ceremony. Dear candidate, Mr. Kourkopoulos, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the way you defended it. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of Doctor. And Professor Seim is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite, therefore, Professor Seim to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Thanos Kourkopoulos, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Please be seated.
Dear Thanos, dear Dr. Kourkopoulos, it's my great pleasure to be among the first to congratulate you today on this great achievement. I think you did a very good job. You presented your PhD project very well, defended it strongly, and you've shown to be very knowledgeable and to own your project. And I think that was a very nice reflection on the last 4 years. With that, I'd also like to congratulate your family, your mother and your sister who are here, your wife, and of course, your little man, Ion, I hope I pronounce it well. I think you can all be very proud on what he did, not only today, but also the last 4 years. I think he really did a good job, so you should be proud of him. Thanos, we met a bit more than 5 years ago when you applied for a PhD project in Venlo that in the end you did not get. However, Dick and I were hugely impressed by you, by the way you presented yourself, your view on science, and also the ideas that you had. And although you did not get that position, we knew that you would be a perfect PhD candidate for a project that combines toxicology and chemistry. So a few months later, we had started up this project, so on the safety assessment of recycled food contact materials. And we immediately reached out to you to ask you if you'd still be willing to do a PhD project. Luckily, you did not find any other position yet, and you were willing to accept this offer, so you applied for the position. And now, 4 years later, we're standing here to celebrate your graduation. You had one important condition before accepting the offer, and that was not moving to the south. You were living together with your wife around Utrecht. She had a job there, so it was not practical at all to come to the south. And although that was not preferable at first, initially, well, we accepted it because it was mainly a burden for you. You had to travel 5 days a week for 4 hours per day by train from Utrecht to Maastricht and back. And I've tried to calculate the exact number of hours that you've been traveling by train over the past few years, which equals up to 3,700 hours in the train. So in total, that means you've traveled full-time in those 4 years, 5 months by train from Utrecht to Maastricht and back. I know the Dutch train system a little bit. You must have serious perseverance and dedication to do that. And perseverance you definitely have. The project that you started had to be set up from scratch. Many of the toxicological assays that we were focusing on were not up and running on the lab, and you had to set them up. Also, the migration work had to be set up, and the chemical analysis had to be explored by you from the beginning. And you did that somewhat perfectly. You devoted a lot of time, work and effort to set up all this work. You validate it, or you optimize your essays, you try to validate them, and you make them applicable to your samples that you use, so your food contact material samples. And I'm saying somewhat perfectly on purpose, because I still remember this one incident that happened where you flooded one of the labs while setting up one of the essays. And I think this shows that no one's perfect, Thanos, also not you. You're very critical and a perfectionist. Not only towards your own work, also towards the work of others. And if I may say, this has led to several heated discussions with some of your colleagues, some of your collaborators. But this typifies you. You don't like to take shortcuts. You always try to push to the maximum. Good is not enough. You want to push the science until, in your view, it is truly solid. And although those meetings were lively, often also quite difficult, I think in the end they led to your science and your project being better, stronger and more convincing. And it is exactly this attitude for you, this critical mind, critical thinking, that made you a better researcher over the past 4 years. You did not only produce good science, you also went out into the world to bring your message. You presented at several international conferences. You went to Eurotox 2023 in Ljubljana, where you presented a poster. You went to the IAFP European Symposium in 2024 in Geneva and 2025 in Madrid, where you presented as a speaker. You presented at the ILSI 8th International Symposium on Food Packaging, which is one of the key meetings, I think, in food packaging research. And on top of that, I think Christa already highlighted, you were invited to present your work at the EFSA Food Contact Materials Network meetings in 2024 and 2025. And I think that is a great recognition, not only to the relevance of your work, but also to the quality of the work that you've delivered. And that is worth a big compliment. The past 4 years have brought you many milestones, not only in your research, also in your personal life. You got married, you bought a house, and you became father for the first time. And these are all big life-changing events, and the fact that you carry those alongside a demanding PhD, with all the traveling and all the intensities that comes with it, is something that I truly admire. I think it really deserves a lot of respect, the way you balanced all that. And it does not only show your dedication and your perseverance, but I think it also shows that you have a great sense of responsibility. Today is one of those milestones, not only because you successfully defended your PhD thesis, but also because now you move on to the next step in your career. And I think you can be really proud of what you've accomplished in the past few years, not only research-wise, but also personally, how you've been growing over those past few years. And I'm very happy that you find a new job, a new challenge at Unilever. And I have no doubt that you will bring the same energy there, and that you will bring the same critical thinking, and that you will bring the same dedication there as you brought to Maastricht for the past 4 years. I will miss you at the department, but I will be very happy to follow you in your next steps. And most of all, I wish you a wonderful future with a lot of success, a lot of happiness, and of course, a good health. Thank you very much, Thanos.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vrolijk, for this nice laudation. Dear Dr. Kourkopoulos, also congratulations with this doctorate that you've got. Congratulations also for your parents, of course, who have done the hard work. To Professor Seim and Dr. Vrolijk for their expertise. And of course, congratulations for your wife and little son and your mother, your sister, and friends and family and colleagues on site and online. I hope you can celebrate this day. As Dr. Vrolijk already said, it's one of the most important days in your academic career, in the scientific career. I would like to thank the members of the opposition for their hard work, of course, and also the PADEL and the technical support team who made this meeting possible, and also took care of the streaming of this meeting. So now I'm about to close this session. What are we going to do? We're going to make a picture at the foot of the stairs. I hope there is a photographer there. And then first we do it with you and the Paranymphs and this team, and then perhaps a second photo with your mother, your sister, your wife and son. And the rest of the audience is asked to already go to the reception room where we will join you later. Yeah? Having said that, I close this meeting.